They were young, vibrant, and full of promise. College students with bright futures, athletes at the peak of their physical health, sons who had just begun building lives of their own. They were the kind of people you never expect to vanish without a trace. And yet, again and again, that's exactly what happened. After an ordinary night out, grabbing drinks with friends, celebrating the weekend, blowing off steam, something went terribly wrong. They left bars alone, maybe to walk home or get some air, and that was the last anyone saw of them. Days later, sometimes even weeks, their bodies were found in rivers or lakes, miles away from where they were last seen. Each case was ruled the same way: accidental drowning. The explanation always followed the same formula. They had too much to drink. They fell in the water. A tragic but simple ending. But for many, that explanation doesn't sit right. Too many similarities, too many odd details, too many unanswered questions. That's why some believe these weren't accidents at all, but part of a chilling pattern. A theory emerged that a hidden group or force was behind these deaths, that the drownings were staged, coordinated, deliberate, and that in some cases, a strange clue was left behind. A piece of graffiti, almost childish in appearance. A crude smiley face painted near the water where the body was found. It's the one detail that turned a string of tragedies into a deeply disturbing mystery. That's how this theory got its name: the smiley face killers. The theory first started gaining traction in the late 1990s when two retired detectives, Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte, noticed something that others had overlooked. They were re-examining the disappearance of Patrick McNeil, a 21-year-old student who vanished one night after drinking with friends at a bar in Manhattan. It was winter. Patrick was seen outside, sick and stumbling. Witnesses later said they saw a man following him, then a van slowly trailing behind. Several weeks later, Patrick's body was found floating in the East River. The official cause of death was accidental drowning, likely alcohol-related. Case closed. But not for Gannon. Something about it didn't make sense. Patrick's body had drifted against the current, which defied basic physics. His hands were locked in a clenched position, something not typical for drowning victims. And there were no clear injuries or wounds that explained what had happened. The more Gannon and Duarte looked into it, the more they felt that this wasn't just a one-off tragedy. They began pulling old case files, and soon they started seeing a terrifying pattern. Other young men from different states and cities disappearing under nearly identical circumstances, always after a night out, always found in bodies of water, and always dismissed as accidents. Over time, their list grew. Dozens of cases, all sharing eerie similarities. And in some of those cases, the detectives reported finding that same symbol, a smiley face, hastily painted in spray paint, near where the bodies were discovered. Not every case had one, but enough did to spark suspicion. Gannon and Duarte began to believe that these weren't random drownings. They were signatures, calling cards, warnings. One case might be a fluke. Two could be explained away as coincidence. But when you start counting in the dozens, things stop making sense. That's what disturbed Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte the most. As they continued researching, they compiled a list of over 40 similar cases, all involving young men who went missing under strikingly similar conditions. Most of them were college students. They were smart, athletic, and physically fit. Almost all of them were white males in their early 20s. They didn't have a history of mental illness or addiction. They weren't running away from anything. These were guys with jobs, futures, families, and they all disappeared the same way, after a night out, usually on foot, often walking alone. Maybe they were heading home. Maybe they were trying to find their car. In every case, it was late, cold, quiet. Then, nothing. No security footage. No clear evidence of a struggle. Just a vanishing. And then, days or weeks later, their bodies would show up in water. A lake, a river, a canal, almost always nearby, but not necessarily where they were last seen. Some were fully clothed, some were barefoot, some looked like they had been moved, and that's where the theory darkened. In several of these cases, graffiti was found near the recovery site. Simple, childlike, a spray-painted smiley face. Sometimes it was drawn on a tree, sometimes on a rock or bridge support, always somewhere close to the water. The faces weren't bright or happy. They looked rushed, drippy, warped, like someone had painted them quickly, maybe in the dark. Not every case had one, but enough did to make the pattern hard to ignore. Always crude, always out of place, always just close enough to make you wonder. That's when the detectives decided to go public. They weren't just looking at scattered drownings anymore. They believed they were staring at the work of a group, possibly a network. Not a lone killer, but multiple people acting together across state lines. The implications were chilling. They floated different theories. Maybe it was a cult. Maybe a loosely connected group using encrypted apps or the dark web to coordinate targets and share footage. Some believed it was a thrill-seeking ring, focused on a very specific type of victim. The victims weren't random. They fit a profile. The detectives also pointed to toxicology reports from some of the autopsies. Several of the young men had traces of GHB in their systems, a powerful sedative and dissociative drug, sometimes used in assaults. The troubling part was that in many of those cases, alcohol was listed as the only substance involved. GHB, being difficult to detect unless specifically tested for, could have been overlooked. That led to the theory that the victims were drugged before they disappeared, possibly rendered unconscious or compliant before being moved. And then to cover the crime, their bodies were placed in water, sometimes days later, to simulate an accidental fall. In some cases, decomposition didn't match the timeline. In others, the men's bodies looked too preserved for the amount of time they had supposedly been submerged. Clothing was intact. Wallets and phones were missing or placed oddly. The whole thing felt off, like someone wanted it to look like a simple accident, but cared just enough to get the details almost right. Almost. But not everyone accepts this theory. In fact, the pushback from law enforcement has been strong. The FBI reviewed the idea of the smiley face killers back in 2008 and publicly stated that there was no concrete evidence to suggest the involvement of a serial killer, let alone a coordinated group. They emphasized that after looking at several of the cases cited, they saw no signs of foul play, just a tragic but explainable pattern. Young men, usually intoxicated, wandering alone near bodies of water. Many of the deaths happened in winter, when poor visibility and freezing temperatures could make even a small mistake deadly. Local police departments across different cities echoed this view. Each time a case came up in the news, the default explanation was the same: alcohol, disorientation, accidental drowning. Some departments were even frustrated that the theory kept resurfacing, claiming it distracted from the real issues, like campus drinking culture and lack of late-night public transportation. And then there's the graffiti itself, the infamous smiley faces. Police said this was the weakest link in the theory. Graffiti, after all, is everywhere. A smiley face is one of the most common tags, along with hearts, initials, and cartoon eyes. It's so generic, they argued, that it shouldn't be considered a clue at all. The locations where the graffiti appeared were often urban, industrial areas, exactly where you'd expect to find all sorts of spray paint. Coincidence, they said, nothing more. But what if it's not just a coincidence? What if the very fact that it's common makes it the ideal symbol? Something so ordinary, so easily explained away, that no one would think twice. That's what made the theory more unsettling for people who look deeper. The smiley face, to the detectives and to many grieving families, became a symbol, Not of random tragedy, but of systematic neglect, a sign that something was being overlooked, intentionally or not. These parents knew their sons. They knew their habits, their drinking limits, their fears, and in case after case, families questioned the official story. Some of them pointed to inconsistencies in the condition of the bodies. One young man was found with dry clothing, even though he was supposedly in the water for days. In another case, a body turned up in a section of the river that had already been searched thoroughly by police and divers. It was almost as if it had been placed there later. Some victims were missing personal items, phones, wallets, shoes, that later appeared in unexpected places, far from where the fall supposedly happened. It felt wrong. Too many details didn't line up, and instead of answers, the families often got silence, or worse, dismissal. The message they received was always the same. Your son had too much to drink. It was an accident. Move on. But they couldn't, because some of these cases were deeply disturbing on their own. Let's take a closer look at a few that stand out. In Minneapolis, 21-year-old Chris Jenkins went missing on Halloween night in 2002. He was last seen leaving a downtown bar dressed in a Native American costume. He vanished. His body was found 4 months later, floating in the Mississippi River. Initially, police said he had fallen in and drowned, but years later, after new evidence came to light, they reversed the ruling. It was no longer an accident. It was a homicide. Police didn't reveal all the details, but hinted that the body showed signs of staging, that he had been placed in the water, not fallen in. In Pittsburgh, another disturbing case emerged. Dakota James, 23 years old, was captured on CCTV walking calmly through the city late at night. He didn't look disoriented. He wasn't staggering. He wasn't running. Then he vanished. His body was found in the Ohio River 40 days later. His family believes he was drugged, abducted, and killed. They say the authorities didn't take their concerns seriously. Another young man, Joey LaBute, disappeared from a Columbus nightclub and was later found in the Scioto River. The coroner couldn't determine a clear cause of death. There were no wounds, no signs of drowning, just silence. These aren't isolated incidents. They repeat a pattern: young men vanishing under similar circumstances, often after nights out, always near water, and always leaving behind a trail of questions that no one seems eager to answer. One of the most disturbing aspects of the smiley face killer's theory isn't just the deaths themselves. It's what the theory implies if it's even partially true. Because if these aren't isolated accidents, if these young men didn't just fall into rivers after a few drinks, then the alternative is terrifying. It means someone, or more likely a group of people, is responsible, and not just in one city or in one state. We're talking about deaths scattered across the Midwest, the East Coast, even parts of the Pacific Northwest. Dozens of young men vanishing under similar circumstances across a span of decades. If this is coordinated, then that means someone is organizing it, tracking people, selecting targets, operating under the radar of law enforcement for years, maybe even decades. And most chilling of all, never getting caught. It's an idea straight out of a psychological thriller, but the details are very real. And history has shown that coordinated evil isn't a fantasy. There have been groups in the past, secret societies, cults, online networks, who've used code words, symbols, and shared ideology to carry out horrific acts. Some are driven by ideology, others by thrill, and some simply by the belief that they can get away with it. That's what makes the smiley face so sinister. And it's not just a mark, it's a message, a mask, something that used to feel innocent and familiar, now twisted into something mocking and cruel. Is it a calling card, a symbol of control, or is it just our minds reaching for patterns in the chaos? That's what splits people down the middle. For every person who sees a terrifying connection, there's someone else who sees randomness. Dots that only connect if you want them to. But even if the theory is flawed, even if there's no single group or grand plan behind all of these deaths, there's something else we can't ignore. A long and growing list of young men whose deaths don't make sense. Their names vary, their cities change, but their stories feel the same. Parents who knew their sons weren't suicidal. Friends who said they didn't drink that much. Cases that get quietly closed with no foul play suspected, even when signs suggest otherwise. These families aren't chasing conspiracy theories. They're chasing answers. And in many cases, they're the only ones who keep pushing after the headlines fade. Some hire private investigators. Others create websites, organize memorial events, and keep their sons' names in the media. What they all share is the feeling that something was missed or ignored by the people who were supposed to help. And even now, the pattern hasn't stopped. As recently as 2022, another case appeared. A young man disappeared after leaving a bar. Days later, his body was found in water. There was no sign of struggle, no clear cause of death. The media called it a tragic accident, but online communities, true crime groups, Reddit threads, investigative podcasts, noticed the pattern immediately. Same age, same profile, same silence. No smiley face this time, or maybe no one thought to look. But once again, the details were close enough to raise eyebrows and hearts. So where does that leave us now? Is this just the unfortunate outcome of nightlife culture in cities built along rivers, young people making risky choices after too many drinks? Or is there a darker thread running through these cases, one we're too afraid to tug on? The idea of an invisible predator, or worse, a group that selects victims with precision and vanishes without a trace, it's terrifying. But what's more terrifying is the possibility that they're hiding in plain sight, that they don't need to run or hide because no one is really looking. The smiley face could be graffiti, or it could be a breadcrumb, a trail marker meant for those paying attention. And maybe that's why the theory won't go away. Because even with denials, retractions, and skepticism, there's something in these cases that lingers, something unfinished, something that feels wrong. Until someone is caught or new evidence is uncovered, the smiley face killer's theory will stay right where it lives best, in the shadows, whispered in forums, discussed in documentaries, and burned into the memories of families still waiting for justice. It lives in the quiet corners of cities where the water runs dark, and in the moments just after midnight when someone young, full of life, steps out into the cold alone and never comes back.